How does one follow that introduction? Well, first of all, by acknowledging the Gayabal and Jarawar people of the First Nations, whose unceded land on which I live and work. But also, I want to extend that tonight to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we are located for this event. I honour their living culture and pay my respect to elders, past, present and emerging. I also thank the Create Centre for their invitation to present this lecture, and to Craig Barker for allowing us the use of this wonderful venue. I'd be remiss if I did not also thank Liam, but also Hugh Griffiths and Anna Camerali. These wonderful scholars are also hosting, as you would have heard, the Australian and New Zealand Shakespeare Association Conference in December, and I encourage everybody to come along, audit sessions, enrol in workshops and become a member. It's not just for academics. It goes without saying, but I will say it anyway, that having people of their calibre put my name forward for this lecture is truly humbling, and I hope the following presentation justifies their faith. My title then is Shakespeare's First Folio, Opening the Time Capsule. Around 400 years ago, father and son printers William and Isaac Jaggard committed to paper a substantial volume bearing the title of Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, along with the claim that the plays therein were printed according to their true original copies. The volume designated 14 plays as comedies, 10 as histories, and 12 as tragedies, 36 plays in all. The collection is more commonly known, of course, as the First Folio. Half the plays it contains represent the earliest surviving printed version. In other words, had the folio not been published, 18 of Shakespeare's plays, including the cultural touchstones Macbeth, The Tempest, and The Winter's Tale, might have been lost forever. Can you imagine a world without these plays? A world without such timeless lines as "Out, damned spot," or "Oh brave new world that has such people in it," or even "Exit pursued by a bear." Unthinkable. Yet I suspect the potential enormity, there's the pop of the P, sorry, of losing half of all Shakespeare, of a world that was shaken perhaps but not speared, is one of the reasons, someone got it, is one of the reasons the folio has been given such a hallowed place in the Anglophone cultural imaginary. In 2016, the world celebrated another Shakespeare 400, collectively marking the quadricentennial of Shakespeare's death. Now cast your mind back to what you were doing on the 23rd of April in that year. And now think about how much you've been through in the 7 years since then. And you'll get a sense of the gap between when Shakespeare died on 23rd of April 1616 and when the folio edition of his works appeared in late 1623. When we think of the relationship between Shakespeare and the First Folio, however, there is a tendency to want to elide that gap. The notion that half of Shakespeare's plays would be lost to us without this book thus makes it seem like an act of preservation, as Liam mentioned, to fix the First Folio and all of the plays it contains in time and space, hermetically sealed off from those 7 years that separated Shakespeare's life from the folio itself. In this sense, I do propose that the book has tended to function like a time capsule into which these plays were placed while he was alive, providing unfettered access to his living imagination. For most people, the image of a time capsule may seem apt when we find ourselves in the presence of the actual book, only ever getting it as close to it as perspex, glass, steel and other crowd control measures allow. It may be exceedingly difficult indeed to think of a book as being alive with history when we encounter it sealed up in this way. I do not make this observation, though, to suggest that museum-style displays of the First Folio are the wrong way to exhibit the book. The issue of how to make publicly available the rare material artefacts of our shared past without exposing those same objects to damage and decay is one that has plagued all of us for as long as archives, libraries and museums have existed. In the case of such a valuable cultural object as the First Folio, I've nothing to offer about how it might be placed on display any better than what you'll certainly currently see at the State Library. Instead, I make the observation about the difficulty of seeing the book as being alive with history when it is sealed up for public exhibition, or more so when it is locked away in a vault, because I recognise that the onus is on historians and textual scholars to provide the histories and readings that can bring the book to life, even as the physical object is under lock and key. My goal in what follows is to offer some stories through which the history captured in this time capsule may be unlocked. To some extent, I offer reasons to separate Shakespeare from his book by dealing with the history of the folio after his death, but I'm not arguing for total separation. I do, of course, maintain that the plays of the First Folio are Shakespeare's, but I shall highlight some of the ways the book helps us to see that these plays continued to evolve long after he was involved in them. Part 1. Let us return then to that moment when, in late November 1623, the First Folio appeared in print. If one were to judge from the acts of the Privy Council at this time, the final days of October and the first few weeks of November in 1623 were what we would call quiet news days. Privy Council meetings were primarily taken up with resolving petty land disputes, a squabble between two companies over trading rights, a request to repair the main sewer in Boston, with locals fearing that the port would be in danger utterly to be lost. There were ongoing troubles in Ireland, and the substantial payment needed to be made, £63.06, to the keeper of His Majesty's cormorants for providing 4 birds to accompany James on a fishing trip during his summer. Yet the councillors may have been busying themselves with numerous trifles precisely so they could avoid responding to what was by far the biggest news story of the day. On the 26th of October, a gathering of around 300 persons on the 3rd floor of Hunsdon House in the Blackfriars in London was cut short when the floor beneath them gave way, bringing a significant number of the crowd down through the 2nd floor and onto the ground floor, which housed the drawing room of the French ambassador's residence, though no ambassador was present at the time. The coroner subsequently fixed the death toll at 95, but independent reports suggest the toll was far greater, and that many of the corpses taken from the rubble during that evening were gone by daybreak. As Alexandra Walsham notes, these bodies had been, quote, presumably borne away by distraught friends and relatives elsewhere, end quote. As the burial record on the 28th of October of 2 parishioners of St Anne Blackfriars, both victims of the accident, do in fact corroborate. Most of the bodies, though, that remained on the site, the 95 declared dead, as Walsham adds, were unceremoniously interred in a mass grave within the embassy's grounds. Now, mass burial was more regularly used for plague fatalities, but it can be explained on this occasion by the fact that the crowd had gathered to hear a sermon delivered by the Jesuit Robert Drury, with the embassy making do for a chapel. In Protestant London, the French ambassador's residence was one of the few locations where Catholicism could be practiced due to the legal indemnity enjoyed by ambassadorial service. 3 weeks earlier, though, Prince Charles had returned from Spain following an unsuccessful attempt to secure a Spanish match, prompting renewed antagonism within London towards both Spain and Catholics in general. Mindful, perhaps, that victims of the accident would be branded posthumously as recusants, many locals would have been moved to rescue some of the dead for burial within their own parish. The city's response was indeed to remove the Catholic corpses from view en masse. As for the Privy Council, their indifference can be understood in terms of the Spanish match. They'd formed a subcommittee, colloquially known as the Junta, to handle confidential matters related to foreign affairs with Spain. And this group had not yet formally conceded that a Spanish match was no longer viable. Thus, the word on all things Catholic in the Privy Council was mum. The word on the street, however, and in the booksellers around St. Paul's, was that God had punished the papists in their midst. When the First Folio appeared on the shelves of the bookseller Edward Blunt in late November, it did so when readers were dining out on the deaths at Hunsdon House. One news account by Thomas Goad was called "The Doleful Evensong, or a true, particular and impartial narration." I can assure you that Goad was anything but impartial, going so far as to point out to his readers that the date of the disaster under the New Style Gregorian calendar was 5 November, marking the anniversary, that is, of the gunpowder plot through which papists had previously planned to assassinate the king. In other words, they got what was coming to them, eventually. After Goad's partial account, there also appeared in short succession a number of pamphlets, sermons, and even a ballad by Matthew Rhodes, "The Dismal Day at the Blackfriars, or a Deplorable Elegy." I begin with this tragic disaster and with the extent to which it became the focus of intense anti-Catholic sentiment at this time, because I feel it is necessary to understand the public mood at the moment that Shakespeare's First Folio became available. It's worth noting in this respect why we refer to the book as the First Folio. The word folio here refers to the size of the page used in the printing of the book. Plays had, for the most part, previously been published in the smaller quarto size, but this book, with 36 plays and more than 900 pages, was printed by the Jaggards in the larger folio size, indicating a more prestigious volume. It's called the First Folio not because it was the first book printed in this size. The Gutenberg Bible, the first book printed on a modern printing press, 1452, was folio for one. Nor was this even the first collection of plays printed in this size, with the works of Ben Jonson of 1616 printed in folio by William Stansby. We call Shakespeare's collection the First Folio, then, because it was subsequently printed in folio several other times. As Liam mentioned, the Second Folio was printed in 1632 by Thomas Coates, and then a third in 1663 by Philip Chetwynd, and then a small consortium of printers produced a fourth in 1685. Thus, the First Folio is so named because it was the first of the folio editions of Shakespeare's plays. Now, before I wander off into book history, you're already no doubt wondering what the paper size and numbers of editions of Shakespeare's plays has to do with the collapsing floorboards at Hunsdon House in 1623. I do have a point, and it's this. I rather suspect that the folio of 1623 would not be called the first because there would have been no second, third, or fourth folio if the book contained any matter that explicitly identified its author as having Catholic sympathies at this time, in this climate. Indeed, I further suspect that the people directly involved in the book, the printers, the compilers, the proofreader, even the compositors who set the type, would have raised concerns before the book went anywhere near a bookshop if they thought it might attract opprobrium while anti-Catholic sentiment was at such a fever pitch. By entering the title in the Stationers' Register on the 8th of November, 1623, Jaggard was confidently committing the book to release as soon as the printing and binding were completed later in the same month. So there's no suggestion that anybody involved in the book felt any fear of reprisals about the book's content. There have, however, been several attempts by scholars to argue that the plays contain Catholic sympathies, and that the First Folio became part of the material chain of evidence for this very argument when a surviving copy was found in 2014 in a city library in Saint-Omer, northern France. The provenance was traced to the library of the English Jesuit College, which some see as evidence that English Catholics in exile in France found sympathetic messages in these plays, and which others went so far as to say points to Shakespeare's own involvement in the Jesuit College network that was driven underground during the Tudor and Stuart reigns. Now, we can easily dispel this second suggestion by reminding ourselves that a dead Shakespeare had no influence on the locations in which his book was bought or sold. The first suggestion is equally untenable, since the presence of a book in the holdings of a library is hardly evidence of the ideologies of the people who maintain those holdings. I contend instead that the context helps dismiss, sorry, I missed a whole line. I contend instead that the context in which the folio was placed on sale with this tragic contemporary event and its aftermath helps dismiss the notion that the book expresses any Catholic sympathies in any overt fashion. Indeed, to readers who find a Catholic worldview encoded in the text, I would contend that such coding must be so subtle as to have escaped the attention of this vehemently anti-Catholic readership to which the book was first released in November 1623. Part 2. The number of copies of the First Folio printed by the Jaggards is normally estimated at 750, but less than 1/3 have outlasted the ravages of time. The discovery in Saint-Omer was only the 233rd copy known to have survived. I remind you, 750 printed, 233 survived. But 2 more were found in 2016, so the total now sits currently at 235. And only 40 are relatively complete. The vast majority are missing pages or even whole sections, and some consist of only a few pages. We let the word surviving do a fair amount of heavy lifting when we use it to describe most copies. Yet if the printers did indeed print the book according to the true original copies, as they claim, we would really only need one complete copy, and we would have access to the plays as Shakespeare had intended them. John Hemmings and Henry Condell reaffirm this by claiming in their address to the great variety of readers that these plays are cured and perfect of their limbs and all the rest, absolute in their numbers, as he conceived them. Many quarto texts were, they say, stolen and surreptitious copies, maimed and deformed by the frauds and stealths of injurious impostors. There's been great stock put in these claims, not least of all by scholars who developed the category of the bad quarto, those plays that deviated too far from the folio text and were therefore seen to be the result of piracy. And there's another strand of thought that's long held that quarto texts in any case were intended for touring and were not the versions performed in the London playhouses. Of course, all quarto texts are different in some way from the folio texts, which leads to debates about which version is more authoritative. Textual scholars have, for over a century, been bedevilled, for example, by Hamlet's wish that his too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, when in the second quarto of 1604, the same lament says instead, this too sallied flesh. While earlier editions favoured the folio texts solid, John Dover Wilson argued in 1934 that sallied was a misprint for sullied, resulting from an error in the printing of the quarto, and many editors during the next 3 decades agreed, either correcting the word in their edition, too sullied, or else using the word sallied and providing a gloss to remind the reader that this was merely a misprint. For editors and textual scholars who favour the folios solid, however, the fact that the preference for the quartos sallied relies on an admission of printer error strengthens their case, and solid is, of course, back in favour. Hemmings and Condell's claim about the perfect state of the texts in the folio should help to settle such matters, of course, but let us look again at their claims. They identify their readership as very broad, from the most able to him that can but spell. And they agree that each reader, from most able to barely literate, will read and censure the book. They ask only that readers accept one condition: do so they say, "But buy it first." "That doth best commend a book," the stationer says. If the reader first thinks this to be a joke, they repeat the instruction, "But whatever you do, buy," with a capital B. The earliest known record of somebody who did buy it is Edward Dering, who purchased 2 copies on the 5th of December, 1623. Dering had already produced what we call the Dering manuscript. And I should say that's Dering, not daring. A text of the first and second parts of Henry IV, conflated into a single play by cutting 2,721 lines from the 2 plays. Dering's conflated play was entered into the Stationers' Register on the 24th of October, 1622. And comparisons of this manuscript to surviving copies of all other 1st, 1 and 2 Henry IVs reveals that he used the 5th quarto of 1 Henry IV and the 2nd issue of the 1st quarto of 2 Henry IV, and not the folio text that he purchased in late 1623. I sometimes find myself wondering what Dering's reaction might have been when he bought these folios and saw Hemmings and Condell's claim that the quartos were not the best sources for a conflated play, maimed as they were, and deformed. We know the editions that Dering used because he replicates the spelling errors in these editions, but not in others. Dering may therefore not only be the first person known to have purchased a copy of the First Folio, he may have also been the first to experience firsthand the taint that the folio cast upon the quarto texts and readers that can but spell. While Dering's manuscript was prepared with the aid of a scribe, Samuel Carrington, we have the payment records, suggesting he had every intention of having it typeset and printed, there's no evidence that it ever did find its way into a printing house. Dering is also known to book historians as an avid collector of manuscripts, and I cannot help but think that his encounter with the folio, foiling his early ambitions to produce a conflated Shakespeare play, was one of the motivations that drove him to collect true original manuscript documents throughout the rest of his life. Perhaps, however, Dering was also the first to recognise that Hemmings and Condell's boast about this book presenting plays that had been cured of the imperfections of the quarto texts was a hollow marketing ploy to boost sales. After all, he paid for 2 copies. If indeed he looked at both of these copies, he was bound to have discovered what later textual scholars of the First Folio also eventually realised. Don't tell me I've been on the wrong slide the whole time. One of the reasons that copies are... Were you on Dering there a moment ago? Yes. Oh, that's right, I just didn't click this. Okay, thank you. One of the reasons that copies are considered so rare is not just that less than... I'm just hearing you all say, "Come on, Laurie, get to the point." No, I'm worried about that. One of the reasons that copies are considered so rare is not just that less than 1/3 survive, but rather that each is also unique. Many of the differences that aid individual identification of each folio arose after it left the print shop, as copies have been damaged or marked, had pages go missing, or were trimmed for rebinding. Importantly, though, there are also differences on 134 pages resulting from the book being proofread while it was being printed. The printing job was parcelled out by setting type for each sheet with plates of arranged metal type locked into a form, and then setting type for the next form, that's a verb, while this was being printed. One of the first sheets would then be handed on to a proofreader while printing of the previous one continued. After the proofreader identified and marked up errors on that print copy, he would be able to stop the press to have the form unlocked and for those corrections to be made by replacing new metal type. Thus, there are copies that contain pages printed before each of these interventions, and there are copies with pages that include these corrections. It's likely, I'd imagine, even in fact almost inevitable, that Dering at some stage noticed that his two copies differed on some pages, including errors in spelling. Him that can but spell, indeed. To be fair, the uncorrected pages are merely artefacts of the process through which the printers were attempting to produce a volume that could live up to the boast about perfected limbs. Had they but whirled enough in time, as Andrew Marvell once wrote, this boast would be no crime. But time was not the Jaggard's friend. William Jaggard's health failed badly as the printing of the folio was taking place, so his son Isaac was keen to accelerate the process. William had previously been embroiled in scandal by printing Shakespeare plays and poems without proper authority, and even resorted to falsifying dates on these publications to make his copies look like authorised texts. Hemmings and Condell surely bristled at the thought of using Jaggard's services, but it's believed that his shop was chosen because it was the only one capable of taking a job of this size at this time. For William's son Isaac, the folio would have been an opportunity, though, to clear their name of the stain of past misdealings. He listed the title in the Frankfurt Book Fair catalogue in March 1622, when printing began, but he delayed entering the title into the stationer's register until within a few weeks of the job being completed. You may remember it was in November 1623. It may be that he chose to register the title at this time to reassure his father, who died shortly afterwards, that the title was nearly ready to be released. The first folio was thus released with numerous errors, but these were diminishing as the print run proceeded. Unfortunately for the printer, a notoriously incompetent compositor, who we now know as Compositor E, produced a high volume of errors during October 1623. For folio scholars, the degree of error has been quite a boon. If you see what something looks like when it's broken, it's easy to picture what it looks like when it works well. Yet I want to raise the prospect that one of the Compositor E errors, corrected by the proofreader, is not an error at all, and that the proofreader entered a deliberate spelling error because it was topical at the time. In 2018, Emma Smith revealed the discovery of a marked up proof sheet in the folio in the library of Queen's College, Oxford, containing, among many errors, an insertion of the letter I to amend the phrase hot-blooded France to read hot-bloodied France in Act 2, Scene 2 of King Lear. Now, Charles Hinman argued in 1963 that this change resulted from an error in the proofing, since hot-blooded is of course in standard use to this day, but hot-bloodied is of course not. As Smith points out, though, the discovery of the proof sheet confirms the change was deliberate and not the result of an error by the proofreader. Smith adds that hot-bloodied is also used in the Merry Wives of Windsor, whereas hot-blooded appears nowhere else in the folio. I'd like to dig further into this question. New research, as they say. The Oxford English Dictionary includes the Merry Wives quotation as the earliest use of the phrase hot-bloodied and labels it a variant spelling for hot-blooded, which should seem to settle the matter. Yet in numerous other instances, the folio texts are entirely consistent in their use of the two words to mean what the Oxford English Dictionary indicates was widely understood at the time. Blooded, when used as the second element in a compound, means having blood or temperament of a specific kind. Bloodied, on the other hand, is used to refer to being covered in blood. Regarding the first term, while hot-blooded isn't used elsewhere in the folio, other compound forms such as cold-blooded slave in King John and sober-blooded boy in 2 Henry IV do appear elsewhere, and Lear itself even includes a reference to a half-blooded fellow. Bloodied, on the other hand, appears 3 other times, but only in one of these, the one in Merry Wives, as a compound. The other 2 are a reference to a bloodied horse in 2 Henry IV, and the bloodied sword of Troilus in Troilus and Cressida. Merry Wives thus appears here to be an outlier, but even in this instance, I think there is some consistency with the OED definitions. When Falstaff invokes hot-blooded gods, he is of course priming himself for sexual conquest, but the god on whom he calls is Jupiter, who used animal disguises to rape Europa and Leda. And before long, Falstaff turns from imagining himself a Windsor stag to asking if he appears as Herne the Hunter. The bloodied gods in this context are not necessarily those possessing just a certain virile disposition. Rather, they are bloodied with images of the hunt and bloodshed, not far from Falstaff's mind. What then of hot-blooded France in Lear? In context, France is described already in the play as having departed with Cordelia in choler. C-H-O-L-L-E-R, not in his collar. That is, in a choleric or hot-tempered manner. So Lear can certainly be taken to mean that the king is hot-blooded, as we would now understand it. The decision to amend to hot-blooded thus seems unnecessary. But with only 32 surviving copies containing the correction, I think it can be argued that these corrections were made quite late in the printing of this sheet. The pages were among those set by compositor E, so they were being proofed during October. And if we are therefore looking at corrections made late in his work, it is possible, I think, to assign this proofreading intervention to quite late in the same month. You may already see where I'm going with this. In Lear's speech, France went from being hot-blooded to hot-bloodied around the same date of the tragedy at Hunsdon House, at the French embassy. Instead of thinking of the proofreader then as restoring the language of the bard, there is scope for reading these corrections in their historical context as the proofreader's semi-authorial contribution to the text. But I might go even further to say that we may need to rethink the compiler's choice of language, such language as maimed and limbs and even stolen in the context of the public reaction to the bodies pulled from Hunsdon House in October 1623. Part 3. I invoke the almighty Jeff Goldblum as here as chaotician Ian Malcolm in Steven Spielberg's blockbuster Jurassic Park, because I'm mindful that the first 2 parts of this lecturette, have been ruled by the figure of death. And I want instead to spend this final part finding a way to bring life back into the frame. To some extent, I hope to have already demonstrated that the story of the First Folio misses key components if we think of it solely as a point of connection to Shakespeare and his life up to 1616. In the time I have left, I want to consider one other life that might be brought into focus through the folio. Much has been written recently about the extent to which Shakespeare's plays were collaboratively produced, with authorship attribution methods being used to test hypotheses about the level and type of involvement by such playwrights as John Fletcher, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, George Peele, and George Wilkins. And in most such investigations, the folio text remains the primary lexical data set. My interest here is not with these collaborators, nor with the methods used to detect their hands in a given section of the folio text, but only because such studies also collapse the distance between the author's life and the folio. It's just that there now are more authors whose lives are involved. The life I will consider instead is that of Thomas Middleton, whose contribution to Macbeth has long been widely accepted, but with question marks over whether he could be called a collaborator who worked on the play together with Shakespeare, or who was a later contributor. Middleton's play The Witch features the characters of Hecate and the witches, as well as 2 songs used in Macbeth, so the overlap is undeniable. Estimates of the date that this was written vary widely from 1606 to 1620, with those who argue for an early date usually favouring suggestions that Middleton worked with Shakespeare on Macbeth together. Now, it should be remembered that there is really no doubt that Macbeth was revised at some point, just in case anyone's about to say, no, you lie. Simon Forman recorded his observation after he watched the play at the Globe on the 20th of April, 1611, and makes no reference to the character of Hecate, and instead of witches, he refers instead to 3 women fairies or nymphs. Some dismiss Forman as an unreliable witness. After all, he was a conjurer. But there's good reason to think that the play probably did use fairies. Raphael Holinshead's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland was the chief source used by Shakespeare for all of the history plays and for the historical tragedies like Macbeth. And Holinshead uses identical terms. I've got it up here, a little bit blurry. The prophecy of 3 women supposing to be the weird sisters or fairies. Using Holinshead as his source, Shakespeare probably also used 3 fairies and no Hecate, just as Forman witnessed in 1611. So the witches must have been added after this date. Forman may hold the key to the date of the revision as well, as he is mentioned in Middleton's play, The Witch. During 1615, the Countess and the Earl of Essex were embroiled in a bitter divorce trial, the scandal of the day. And one item of evidence used in the trial was a letter by the Countess to Forman asking for a magical potion or philtre to cause the Earl to leave her. A reference to this event in The Witch helps at least to date Middleton's play to 1615 or later, after Shakespeare had retired to Stratford and was not long for this world. It makes sense then to presume that Middleton recycled this material in a late revision and not in a collaboration with Shakespeare. Middleton is also now presumed to have had a hand in the folio texts of at least 2 other plays, with both Measure of Measure and Timon of Athens, including Gary Taylor and John Lavanino included by Gary Taylor and John Lavanino in their Oxford edition of the collected works of Thomas Middleton. And cases have been made based on stylometric analysis for his hand in All's Well That Ends Well and Titus Andronicus. Opinion tends to favour the idea that 3 of these were revised by Middleton after 1616, with only Timon being described by John Jowett in that collection as a genuine collaboration around 1606. Now, I'm in no position to refute Jowett's stylometry, but I do want to mention biographical details drawn from the life of Middleton, which complicate this picture. Middleton was only 19 when an early attempt at satirical verse was burned during the bishop's ban of 1599. During the next few years, he appears to have focused on becoming a playwright, and I believe there's evidence of his training with a stable of writers paid by Philip Henslowe for the plays for the Lord Admiral's Men from 1602 to 1603. Middleton had not yet reached his majority in 1602, so it makes sense to find him among a group of playwrights paid for one play in 1602 early as one of the rest. And there are other similar payments in the next few months. By 14th of December 1602, he was paid for adding a prologue and an epilogue to an old play, Friar Bacon, in preparation for a court revels performance. Finally, in 1603, sometime before March, he and Thomas Dekker were paid for their play, The Honest Whore, indicating full recognition of co-authorship. The court item strikes me in particular as one that marks the end of something like an apprenticeship, and his collaboration with Dekker, 8 years Middleton's senior, looks like a partnership between equals. Another piece of evidence to support this conjecture is Middleton's marriage. For the biographical essay in the Oxford collection, Taylor cites a record of the budding playwright's marriage to Mary Magdalene Morbeck in 1602, but there's no specific date or linked parish record, and Taylor admits that he actually can't find the record in question. The precise date of Middleton's marriage thus remains a mystery, but I may add some certainty by looking at the date of the birth of their son Edward, whose baptism record I found in the parish register of St Mary Lambeth on the 24th of February 1604. Sorry, I've only got a map rather than the actual parish records. Thomas and Mary would thus have been married no later than May 1603, which matches the notion that he was free to do so, having reached his majority by December 1602. But there's a tantalising hint that the marriage record may be in the parish register of St Mary Newington. I just didn't get enough time for permission to allow me to show you the slide in question. I apologise. Now, on the page in question, there is damage to this page obscuring nearly all entries for March 1603. I think I can make out a Thomas M on that blotch. I was going to show it to you so you could hopefully be persuaded. However, I do think also that technological assistance may be needed to bring it out to light. And so if anyone's got a bucket of money to pay for some technological assistance, that'd be appreciated. In any case, the two churches of St Mary that are cited here are close to where Middleton and his wife were living by 1609, when he's first recorded as being a resident of Blackman Street in Newington. These records indicate then, however, I would argue that Thomas and Mary may well have already been aiming to settle in that same area by 1603. What's all of this got to do with the question of Middleton's potential collaboration with Shakespeare? My point is that it provides a picture of an early career trajectory on which Middleton set himself and which reached its initial culmination when he was 26. From being involved in collaborations of various kinds through his early years as a playwright, there are from 1605 to 1607 7 plays that appear in print or which are documented in the public record as sole authored plays by Middleton alone. He was by that time in a settled marriage, had a young son, a house outside the city walls near St George's Fields, and establishing a strong track record of popular plays in a competitive market. The lawsuit of 1609 involved his claim to have not been paid for writing a play, a loan for which he'd been commissioned in 1606. This is probably what prompted him to revisit his collaboration with Dekker in 1609 with the play The Bloody Banquet. But from the vantage point of his activity in 1606, a collaboration with Shakespeare appears unlikely. I'm thus inclined to think that Middleton's hand in Timon was also a much later revision during a time when he was involved in a number of collaborations and smaller jobs like play revisions to stave off financial difficulties. Now, of course, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll bring matters to a close. To conclude, I hope to have offered food for thought to help open out our understanding of the First Folio as an object that bears witness to more than the genius of William Shakespeare. It does not diminish the greatness of a playwright to acknowledge that the plays circulated on stage and in print in a thriving industry that existed before he arrived in London and long after he departed both London and this mortal coil. I had some thought of also discussing the lives of the players. No, I hear you cry. But perhaps it need only be added in closing here that in my book on Leicester's Men and their plays, due to be out soon, I identify Hemmings as a player whose career began in the first major Elizabethan playing company, right alongside George Bryan, Will Kemp and Thomas Pope, all of whom went on to become members of the Lord Chamberlain's Men with Shakespeare, helping to shape the plays that Hemming and Condell included in the First Folio of 1623. There is still more history locked away in the First Folio waiting to be told. Thank you for your time. I'm very mindful of the time.
So much, Laurie, for that, and we do want to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. As you can see, there are time constraints, so before I return the microphone to Laurie, let me give you a brief outline, because of course what we have after this is the book launch. So for those of you wondering what this is all about, how this was a two-part event, the previous 3 lectures, those given from 2020 up to now, by John Belgian, Watson and Kate Gore, have been published with the help of Westwords as books. And so we're having a little launch for those, but unfortunately there's just a tiny 5-minute walk to get us from here to where we can all share a glass of something, and also, because we are responsible servers of alcohol, there is food as well, so it's definitely worthwhile making the walk with us. What I'd like to do now is hand the microphone back to Laurie and just allow him to take a couple of questions. If you find that you don't get the opportunity to ask something you wanted, please come with us to the book launch, where there'll be plenty of conversation and the chance to ask the expert directly. So we'll look forward to extending that conversation. But right now, if you do have a question, please jump right in, and let's just allow a couple of minutes for that.
Thanks, Anna.
Hi, I'm Thomas DeAngelis. I work at the Create Centre as a research associate and at the university. I had a question around, and it's deliberately kind of provocative, thank you so much for this lecture. To what extent will we ever know what the exact words of the very premiere version of Hamlet was or were? And to what extent does that even matter to you?
Thank you. And just for repeating for the recording, the question was ultimately, to what extent will we ever know the original words of Hamlet in particular, and to what extent does it even matter? Two-part question. Very good question. I've written a bit about the Hamlet question previously, but it's a speculation that I think we get some sense of what the early text may have been through the bad Quarto 1, not following Terry Bouros's argument that it's actually the Q1 or Quarto 1 is the text of the early Hamlet, but that it does contain some sense of what that early text probably did contain as a kind of, whether it's a memorial reconstruction, whether it's a whatever kind of transmission methods involved, it tells us that it was a different text. Same as we know Macbeth changed, that we have some signs necessarily that all texts had a life. All of these plays were changed in some way. So to what extent we could ever know what the original text would be, since we don't actually have any actual manuscripts of Shakespeare's writing of those plays, I don't think we'll ever know, despite what some people claim that really the folio is the memory of those texts. I think it's a forlorn hope. To what extent does it matter? I think if you put a lot of stock in the individual genius of Shakespeare as the arbiter of his intention, I think it matters a lot, but I'm in the school of thought to say that really what's interesting is the historical processes involved in that, and in a sense, it matters more that we don't know, I think is probably the most correct answer I could give you there. That there's a lot of work still to be done in not just understanding Shakespeare's work, but many others.
Again, thank you very much for the most stimulating and enlightening presentation. Just one comment though on how accurate or otherwise, how definitive or otherwise the plays in the folio would be. Is it not comforting that at least it was compiled by two people that worked with Shakespeare
Absolutely.
In his company? So they would have perhaps the best idea of any, even 7 years after his death.
Absolutely. So the question there is it comforting in some sense that the texts were compiled by actors who were in the company and so are as well equipped as anybody to remember what the original text would have been? Absolutely, it's comforting in that respect. Also, however, it's virtually, I think, irrefutable evidence that they were people directly involved in the adjustment of those plays in time after the text. So I've written in the past, for example, about Taming of the Shrew, containing references to players who only were in the company after 1620 and so couldn't have been in the original play. However, Hemmings and Condell are part of the company through that process, and they become part of that transmission as well. So they become part of the repository of the change, as well as a fairly reliable recorder of what the text probably was, at least in principle, or the gist of it, if you like, the soul of the play beforehand. Yeah.
And as you also pointed out earlier, at some point, perhaps a little conflict of interest emerged in that they became businessmen. They were
Absolutely.
very keen to move the thing on.
That's right. I think we have to remember, sorry, the follow-up there is that they weren't businessmen and they were keen to move the thing on. I think it's important to remember that Bill Ingram's work on the business of playing was sort of pivotal in this respect 30 years ago, and we still have a lot of work yet to do to understand how the business of playing very much shaped how decisions were made, even by Shakespeare himself during his lifetime as well.
And just finally, if you don't mind, the question I had was, given what you said earlier about the mysterious and sort of bumbling compositor E, how likely is it really that at some way through the process, when the floor collapses in the French embassy, that compositor E would have the wherewithal and the sophistication to start inserting an eye?
No, actually, thank you. Sorry, the question there is about to what extent compositor E would have had the wherewithal to insert the eye. Someone asked me this question after a dry run as well, and I realised that I wasn't quite clear enough. I tried to correct the text to bring it clearer. Really, what I'm trying to argue there is the proofreader that inserted the eye, not the compositor. So the compositor actually, I think, got it right. One of the few things he got right was hot-blooded, but the proofreader thought, oh, I want to make a contemporary reference right now by changing it to bloodied France. Yeah. I think that's probably as much time as we're going to have. Is it, Anna?
I think maybe that.
But certainly feel free to follow up with me after I'm coming along for the.
It's more motivation for us all to go together and continue the conversation. Will you join me, please, in thanking Professor Laurie?